guys and guysesses, welcome back to my channel TheTarative, and thank you for stopping by. So as promised, this video is going to be all about my labour and delivery. For those of you who are new to this channel or who haven't seen the last few videos of mine, I've recently given birth to my first child. So this video is going to be discussing everything from the first contraction right up until the moment of giving birth to her. I will also be discussing what happened very shortly after giving birth, as there was a bit of an emergency situation. Things got quite serious quite quickly, so I will be discussing everything with regards to that. I will also be sharing some photos and video of my beautiful baby daughter from the first few days of her life. So without further ado, let's just get into the video. So things started happening on Monday the 16th of July at 2 o'clock in the morning. I awoke to the pain of contractions. So yes, my contractions had officially started. From 2 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock in the morning, my contractions had progressed from being 10 minutes apart to being 6 minutes apart, and from lasting 15 to 25 seconds in length to then lasting 45 seconds in length. I couldn't actually remember how close together the contractions had to be and for how long they had to be lasting before I had to go into the birth centre. So I just gave the birth centre a call. They were really helpful, really informative. They let me know that once the contractions were lasting a minute each, and I was having 3 contractions in the time span of 10 minutes. At that point, I should give them a call back, and then they would then advise coming into the birth centre. So I was like, great, fantastic, I now know what I'm doing. And then things slowed down. So pretty much as soon as I got off the phone to the birth centre, the contractions went from lasting every 6 minutes to lasting every 8 minutes, to them being 10 minutes apart each, to then being 20 minutes apart each, and then they slowed down to about being 20 to 30 minutes apart. So I was like, oh, fantastic. So there was no reason for me to be going into the birth centre as things had slowed down. I did have a midwife appointment scheduled, a 40-week midwife appointment scheduled for 11:30 that day. So I went along to that, explained what was happening, she did the usual checks, and then she sent me on my way. Now throughout Monday, I was a little bit miffed, as I had actually had pretty much not much sleep whatsoever, as I had been awake from 2 o'clock that morning, and I was still having contractions, and they were uncomfortable and they were really quite painful when they were happening, but they had slowed down to being every half an hour, and I had a bit of like, oh, why am I still getting these pains if they're only lasting 30 minutes apart? And I knew that things could slow down and then pick up again, but I was a little bit miffed because when I was having contraction, I was like, oh, well, I'm getting this pain and it's not really doing anything. At least when they were happening every 6 minutes, I was quite hyped up. I was like, oh, great, things are progressing. We're going to hopefully be having a baby within the next day or two. So when they slowed down, I was a little bit miffed. But anyways, I had dinner that night with my husband. We went to bed. I didn't see the point in staying awake and walking around to try and progress things, as I hadn't had much sleep. And I thought, well, if they do progress, they might start progressing whilst I'm asleep. There's no point whilst they're every half an hour apart and then only an hour apart by the time I was going to bed. There's no point trying to progress things. If things pick up, they'll pick up. So Tuesday morning came around, my husband went off to work. I did actually have contractions from waking up that morning, but again, they weren't very close together and they were still lasting about 45 seconds each. At that point, I did actually have the TENS machine put on me. My husband helped put the electrodes on me. For those of you who don't know what a TENS machine is, it is a little electrical device that has 4 electrodes that you place 2 above sort of your pant line and then 2 below your bra line, so basically on your back, on your lower back, and sort of on your mid back. And this little electrical device controls impulses to those electrodes, and basically it's meant to help with labour pains. Now I should actually mention that throughout the whole labour I didn't actually have any back labour pains, even before I put the TENS machine on. In fact, I was just feeling every contraction right at the front of my stomach area, basically where you would normally feel period pains. So I didn't actually have any back labour whatsoever, but I still put the TENS machine on. It kind of helped a little bit with distracting me because I could just increase the electrical impulses every time I had a contraction. I don't think it actually really helped with the pain whatsoever, but it sort of helped me cope with it in the fact that it was distracting me, or at least it was in the early stages of labour. So basically I had that TENS machine on and I was using it also to time the contractions. I had a little timer on, so that was quite useful rather than having to use my phone, especially because I'd be using my phone to keep my husband updated. So throughout Tuesday, my contractions did actually get closer together, and I think they had got back up to about every 5 minutes apart, or every 5 minutes apart by the time my husband was back from work. So that was great. Now that evening, that's when things started progressing. They started coming on faster and they were stronger and they were lasting a lot longer. And with the pain of contractions, they did stop me. So I'd be walking around a little bit, but I did have to pretty much stand still whilst having the contractions. And I really focused on my breathing. I was taking nice deep breaths in and slow breaths out. And that really helped cope with the initial contractions or the initial intense contractions. So that really helped. Now, I believe it was about 9:30 that evening when things actually started happening, or things started progressing even more. I was having contractions between every 3 to 4 minutes apart, and they were lasting a minute. Some were lasting a minute and a half, so things had really progressed. So at that point, I gave the birth centre a call and I explained how far apart they are. Basically, they asked a few questions. My waters hadn't broken at that point. However, I did actually forget to mention, on Monday morning, I did actually lose some of my mucus plug, and it was only a little bit, but I could tell that's what it was. And Tuesday morning, when I woke up, I lost a lot more of the mucus plug, and that's when I noticed when things started progressing even further. So I was on the phone to the birth centre, they asked me a series of questions, my waters hadn't broken, but I had lost my mucus plug, and I was at that point with the contractions that they said, if you want to come in, you definitely can do. I don't think they thought I would be having a baby anytime soon, but they did say, well, you can definitely come in and we can help manage pain, give you pain relief if that's what you need. So once we'd gathered all our stuff together, my hospital bag, the baby's hospital bag, and just bits and bobs in general that we thought we would needed, we then headed over to the birth centre or to the hospital, and the journey was about 30 minutes, so it wasn't bad. I was actually worried when I got off the phone to the person I spoke to at the birth centre that the contractions would start slowing down again, like they had the previous day, and yes, I was right. So they went from being 3 to 4 minutes apart and lasting over a minute to lasting still about a minute, some over a minute and some just under a minute, but they did slow down to being about 4 to 5 minutes apart. So I was like, great, we're basically going to be at the birth centre, things will probably start slowing down again, and then we'll be sent home. If you just heard that, that is my little daughter making some noises. She is probably going to wake up soon, so we'll just see if I can finish this before then. If you're wondering why my arm is going back and forth, it is because she is next to me in a Moses basket and I'm just rocking her on the rocking stand. So hopefully that will keep her nice and peaceful whilst I try and get through the rest of this video. So when I got to the birth centre, I said, oh, things have started slowing down, and the midwife there, she was very, very lovely. She said, don't worry, often it can do when it's in that critical moment. Things can slow down, it's nothing to worry about, they'll probably pick up. And I was like, oh, I don't think they'll pick up, I think things will slow down again. But I was very, very wrong. Now, within a few minutes of being at the birth centre, she was just writing down some details, doing general checks, things started progressing. The contractions picked up, they were basically every 2 to 3 minutes apart, and they were lasting well over a minute each. They were very, very intense, so things had hit hard and fast. So yes, I was definitely wrong with thinking things will be slowing down. But I was pleased. Now basically from 9:30, or from about, I think I was there, yeah, it must have been 10:30, and I did actually end up giving birth at 4:17 in the morning. Things got faster and they got a little bit more painful, and by a little bit I mean a lot more painful. So as I mentioned, I had the TENS machine on, my waters hadn't broken, and I think I was at the hospital for an hour or two when my waters broke, but within about 40 minutes of me being there, they checked me. I was actually between about 4 and 5 centimetres dilated, so they were really pleased with that, and they could see the waters right there. So I do actually have some notes from the midwife that says what the first, second and third stages of labour and how long they lasted. Basically, the first stage of labour is when your contractions, I think, go from just starting up until the point of you reaching 10 centimetres dilated. The second stage of labour is when you're 10 centimetres dilated, so from reaching 10 centimetres of dilation to then giving birth to your baby. And then the third stage of labour is the time it takes from giving birth to your baby to then giving birth to the placenta. So on the notes, it says for me that the first stage of labour was 3 hours and 5 minutes. However, I am pretty sure that they just started timing the first stage of labour from my waters breaking up into the point of being 10 centimetres dilated. So yes, so from waters breaking to being 10 centimetres, it was 3 hours and 5 minutes. Now, throughout that 3 hours and 5 minutes, the contractions were hard and fast. Oh, okay, I'll just be a moment, okay? Alora's crying. Back again. So yes, so those 3 hours and 5 minutes, I'm not going to lie, I pretty much felt like I was being tortured. The pain and intensity of the contractions for me were reaching an unbearable point. So as I mentioned, I had the TENS machine on throughout pretty much all of Tuesday. And by this point it was reaching Wednesday early hours. Now, if you'd watched my birth plan video, I did mention that at some point I would actually quite like to get into the birth pool, and the midwife kept saying to me or asking me, just let me know when you're ready to go into the birth pool. But actually pretty much at that point, when I realised how intense the contractions were, I didn't want to get into the birth pool because I heard it can slow things down, and I just really did not want to slow down the dilation. I wanted it over and done with. I was starting to not cope very well whatsoever. So yes, it was very, very intense. And actually the midwife said, oh, just try a little bit of gas and air, and I really didn't want to. When I had one contraction, I used the gas and air, and after the first bit I really didn't want to use it again. It made me feel very lightheaded and very faint, and I really hate that feeling. It was a very weird sensation. But then the next contraction came on, and I grabbed the gas and air and started puffing on it. And I have to say, actually, the gas and air for me worked wonders. It didn't get rid of the pain, but it almost made me feel like I was drunk, and it made it feel like the pain, even though I was feeling the pain, it didn't really make me feel too bothered about the pain. So I have to say the gas and air was brilliant. I probably should have started on that a little bit sooner. However, because I did leave it to the last stages, it really helped take the intensity away from the last few hours of labour. So yes, that was fantastic. I do remember at one point I was about 9.5 centimetres dilated. However, her head was there, it was down, it was great. She was in pretty much the right position, but she was facing towards the side. Now, in the ideal situation, you want the baby's head facing your back, as that is the easiest way for the baby to come out, and the easiest way for you to push her out is for the baby to be facing backwards. So because she was facing on one side, at one point they called it, what did they call it? Oh, they called it a peanut, and it was almost like, kind of like a space hopper, but literally in a peanut shape. It was quite big, and they put that between my legs to keep them apart, so far enough apart that she could still progress coming down, but I was laying on one side to help coax her around to one position. Because I was 9.5 centimetres dilated and she was facing to one side, I still had a bit of a lip around before they sort of wanted to get me to push. However, I did feel that urge to start pushing, and so at that point they said, yep, go with the flow, it's okay. And they realised that actually once I started pushing, because they looked down, it was getting rid of that little lip of cervix still around it, and so they thought actually I could probably just with pushing get rid of that. So in the notes it says that from reaching 9.5 centimetres, or pretty much from 10 centimetres of being dilated to actually giving birth to her, it was 1 hour and 7 minutes. And I actually remember pushing and thinking, oh my goodness, how many pushes, but I could feel that intensity. But the gas and air worked wonders at that point. I was really pleased that I decided to have the gas and air at that point. And when I actually gave birth to her, I was actually on the birthing stool. So they got me on the birthing stool. It was basically like a toilet seat, but just a U shape, and it had enough gap so that they could obviously help deliver the baby. They got my husband, so Dan was sat behind me on the bed so I could lean back and he could help support me during it, and then my legs were quite far apart, and I think it was actually only a few pushes before her head was delivered. But I remember, so at that point, so for a few minutes before, they got me to stop with the gas and air as they wanted me to be really listening. I had been puffing on it for quite a while, even though I'd be breathing normal air in between. I had been puffing on it quite a bit, and they wanted me to be completely compos mentis whilst giving birth to her, and also so I could really just transfer all my energy into pushing. So yes, pushing came along, and I remember pushing and feeling the intensity. So basically they say it's really stingy, and yes it is. I think some people call it the ring of fire, I think that's what they call it, and I can see why, because that bit is one of the most painful bits, and it's very weird because they basically say push as if you're going to have a poo, and you really do, you really just push it all. So deep breath in, and then you just have to really push, almost like you're pushing, rather than breathing out, you're kind of doing your breathing out by pushing into your bottom. And that was a very weird feeling, I have to say, but I could feel it stretching, I could feel her head there, and I remember at one point feeling her head there and then go up slightly as I stopped pushing, as the contraction had ended. And then I remember with the next contraction, I could I could just feel it, but I could feel her stay. So I was like, oh my goodness, fantastic. And I have to say, once her head was delivered, the intensity, like, it was still very, very stingy. And at that point, they told me beforehand, basically, once the head is out, you just need to start breathing. Don't try not to push, so until they tell you to, if you need to. So the head was there, and it was a really uncomfortable situation. I remember them saying, or I remember asking actually, is her head there? Has it stayed out? They're like, yeah, it's there, you can feel it if you want. I was like, no. And they were like, oh, okay. I think it sounded maybe a bit snappy on my part, but it was just because I didn't see the point in touching a head. I really just wanted to then get her out at that point. So with the next contraction, they just told me to push slightly, and it was pretty much just her body just plopped out. That's the best way I can describe it. It pretty much just plopped out, and the relief was amazing. I have to say, at that point, I could not feel anything whatsoever. It went from really, really intense contractions and pain down there to not being able to feel a thing. It was as if someone had just flicked a switch and the pain was just instantly gone. It was incredible. And then things got manic quite quickly. So they put my darling little baby daughter on my chest, and I remember she was all slippy and gooey, and because I was on the birthing stool, I didn't have the best support of myself, and I was like, oh, she's slipping, and they were like, oh, don't worry, fine. But then they took her off me. Well, they sort of pulled her back, and I could tell that something was happening. They basically, I think one of the midwives went out, or they pressed a button. People started pouring into the room. They explained that I had started bleeding. So this is the situation that I meant about what had happened straight after giving birth. As soon as I'd given birth to her, I had started bleeding a lot. So they expect a certain amount of blood, but I was bleeding more than they were hoping for or were wanting to see. So Dan didn't get the chance to cut her umbilical cord. They basically took her from me. The midwife cut her umbilical cord. I remember 6 to 8 people swarmed in, and then Dan had to go off to one side. I was kind of half with it at that point. I wasn't fully with it. I was aware that something was happening, and they said about a PPH, and I knew what that meant. So for those of you who don't know what PPH mean, that is a postpartum hemorrhage. Now, I had heard that term before, and I was very well aware, unfortunately, about what that was and how severe and how things can go south if they don't see it that quickly. And I just remember thinking at that point, because even though the midwives and the doctors were trying to stay calm, you could tell that they were worried and they were panicked a bit, but they were trying to deal with the situation as calmly as possible, obviously trying to keep me calm and to try and keep Dan calm. But yes, things got very, very manic. So they helped me back up onto the bed, and then at that point I was on my back. They wanted to deliver my placenta. Basically, I was still bleeding at that point. They weren't sure if it was the placenta or what it was. So, as I mentioned in the birth plan video, with the delivery of the placenta, I wanted it to be as natural as possible if I could, or they can give you an injection to make things speed along. Now, in that situation, they gave me the injection in my thigh. I didn't really have a choice. So they gave me an injection in the thigh. Remember, basically 4 things were happening to me at once. I was on my back. I had the midwife. She was holding on to effectively what was the umbilical cord, but the part that was attached to the placenta. And I had a doctor or a nurse, I'm not really sure. He gave me an injection in my leg, which was the injection to help speed up the placenta coming away. However, when they looked, they actually noticed the placenta had already come away itself. So the midwife was holding onto the umbilical cord and wiggled the placenta out of me. And they gave me the gas and air to deal with the discomfort at that point. Then that midwife came around to my left-hand side. I remember I had the guy who was doing an IV in my hand, if I remember correctly. And then I had another lady give me another injection, and that injection was to help with clotting, I believe, because they did say, but again, I was really spaced out at that point. Remember at one point, I think they did a catheter to get rid of some urine, so they put a catheter in, and then I had one female doctor who had to help contract my uterus. So basically, I know I rambled on a little bit, the reason why I was still bleeding was because my uterus hadn't started contracting. After you give birth, your uterus is meant to continue start contracting and start shrinking down, and so you get a bit of blood. But when that doesn't happen naturally itself, you just continue bleeding. So that's basically why I was getting so much bleeding. So she had to, and sorry if this is too much detail, do feel free to click off, but I'm not showing pictures or anything obviously, but the description might not be the best. She had to put her hand in the side and she had to manually massage my uterus from the inside and the outside to help it start contracting. So yes, as you can imagine, that was very, very pleasant and not. So yes, quite manic. And I just remember lying there and things were happening and I was dealing with it because I was on the gas and air, so I was kind of half out of it. And I remember looking off to the side and I could see Dan at that point holding our baby, and I hadn't actually really got to see our baby's face. I just remember seeing her head, and the way that Dan was holding her, I could just see her head and I could see him sitting there and I could see him trying his best not to look worried. I knew how worried he was, and yeah, I knew at that point he would be panicking. However, I could tell he was trying to hide that panic from his face. He was trying to do his best, but I knew he'd be panicked and worried. He's just been handed a brand new baby and he just sees his wife with people around him, things happening to her. And I have to say, the midwives and the doctors were really, really good. I know they explained to him really well about what was happening, but that still doesn't take the panic away because you just don't expect that situation. So luckily, I started responding quite quickly to everything they were doing to help with the bleeding. And so within, I don't know how long it was, I wasn't really aware of the time, but I think within sort of like 20 minutes or so, everything was sorted. But at that point, I still couldn't hold our daughter. I then got whisked off to the delivery unit, which is where more complicated births they send you to, or you start off there if you've already got some complications from the beginning. But I got whisked off there. Oh, sorry. Okay. I'm just gonna have to see to little Alora again. I'll be just a minute. Back again. So I had to get whisked off to the delivery unit. Dan still had our little baby daughter at that point, and they later joined me. I think it was about 10-20 minutes later. Now when I was up on the delivery unit, they checked, so I did actually have a tear, but it was only a 2nd degree tear to the perineum, so that wasn't too bad. But I remember having to lie down again with the gas and air. I had my legs in stirrups and she was stitching me up. At that point, Dan and Alora came through and they got me starting to breastfeed at that point. Actually, they got me on skin to skin and starting to breastfeed whilst I was getting stitches done down there. So yes, it was rather manic, but everything was fine with Alora. She was absolutely perfect. They were not worried about her whatsoever. They did all her checks and everything was great. It was just manic for me. So because of what had happened to me with the bleed, they wanted to observe me overnight and do some more checks. So unfortunately, we did have to stay in the hospital overnight. At that point, we had kind of just wanted to go home as soon as possible. But because of the bleed, they had to make sure I was okay and to make sure that it wouldn't pick up again. Oh, bless you. Bless you again. She is awake, but she's just looking around and had some sneezes. So yes, yeah, that was rather eventful. It was quite manic, but again, everything was absolutely fine. And the next day, I was absolutely fine. So that was great. We could then go home. Actually, we didn't get discharged until that evening. So we were in the hospital pretty much nearly 2 days, because we were the whole of Wednesday and pretty much the whole of Thursday, and we got discharged about 5-6 o'clock in the evening, and we were so glad to get home. So that pretty much is the whole of my labour and delivery story. I've got little Alora squeaking in the background, so I'll end this quite promptly. I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then remember to give it a thumbs up. I'd be really interested to hear, for those of you watching who have had children, please let me know your labour and delivery stories in the comment section down below. I'll be really interested to read and compare. I think it's so fascinating how one person to the next can have completely different labours and deliveries, and how from one baby to another, even with the same person, can be so different. So please tell me your stories down below. I'll be really interested to read them. Also, just after I end this video, I will be sharing some pictures of little Alora from the first few days of her life and a little video clip, so do stay tuned for those. Okay, so since she is now crying, I will have to love and leave you guys. Thank you so much for all your support and kind messages. I will be doing more videos in the future, so stay tuned for those. Do remember to subscribe and do your notifications for when I post new videos. Okay guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I shall see you next time. Bye for now.